For years, I was invisible to my family, ignored, dismissed, and overshadowed by my brother's success. They handed him everything, while I was left to fight for every scrap of my dream. But what they didn't know was that I didn't need their support to rise. 6 years later, I reached the top without them, and when they finally realized who I had become, it was already too late. It was always him, never me. From the moment my brother was born, I was invisible. It wasn't that they didn't see me. I was there, in the background, just never the focus. He was the golden child. He was the one with the potential, the one who needed all the resources, all the attention. He was the one they believed would make it big. Me? I was just the filler, the placeholder. I remember how my parents would talk about him like he was destined for greatness. They'd beam with pride when discussing his future, his aspirations, his accomplishments. Everything he did was worth celebrating. But when it came to my dreams, they dismissed them without a second thought. When I was younger, I had dreams just like any other kid. I wanted to be someone special, someone who could carve a place for themselves in a world that didn't make space for everyone. But that was before I realized that my dreams meant nothing in my family's eyes. My parents, especially my father, had already made up their minds. My brother had the brains, the looks, the charisma, the qualities they believed would take him to the top. I, on the other hand, wasn't even given a chance to try. I've lost count of the times I've heard my mother say, "Why don't you just be happy with what you have?" As if contentment could somehow replace ambition. What they didn't understand, what they refused to understand, was that I wasn't looking for handouts or sympathy. I was looking for a chance, but I never got it. I could see it in the way my parents would shower him with expensive gifts, enroll him in the best schools, make every decision in his favor. Meanwhile, I was expected to be grateful for the scraps they threw my way, and when it came to anything I wanted to do for myself, I was met with skepticism, disappointment, and sometimes outright rejection. "Why would you want to pursue that?" My father asked me once when I told him about my passion for writing. "It's not a career. It won't pay the bills." The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, struggling to even be heard, and they were handing my brother everything he could ever want, all because they were convinced that his dreams were more valuable than mine? At times, I tried to bury it, to push my desires deep inside, to silence that inner voice that told me I deserved more. But the resentment built up. It festered inside of me until it became something I couldn't ignore anymore. But I wasn't giving up. No matter how many times I was told I wouldn't make it, I refused to believe them. I didn't need them to believe in me. I would prove it to myself. And so, I fought. I fought for every opportunity I could find, scraping together every penny, working long hours, taking on jobs that drained me physically and emotionally. While my brother lived a life cushioned by privilege, I learned to survive by my own grit. I stumbled, I fell, I struggled, but I never gave up. Every setback fueled me more. Every time I was knocked down, I got back up. I didn't have a safety net, but that didn't matter. I wasn't going to let their neglect define me. They thought I would crumble. They thought I'd settle for mediocrity. But what they didn't know was that I had already made a decision. I was going to make it. I was going to succeed, and when I did, they'd see exactly what they'd missed. The world had written me off, but I was determined to rewrite my story. As I look back now, I realize that the pain of their neglect only made me stronger. I had no choice but to fight for my place in this world, and that fight led me to the very thing I had always wanted, the chance to prove that I could stand on my own. No handouts, no favoritism, just me and my relentless will to succeed. In the beginning, I was just trying to make it. But I quickly learned that it wasn't just about achieving success, it was about reclaiming what I had always been denied, respect, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get there. The road to success wasn't a straight line. It never is. It twisted, turned, and sometimes felt like it was going to swallow me whole. I found myself in situations I never thought I'd be in, forced to make sacrifices that would break most people. But each sacrifice was one step closer to what I knew I deserved. I remember the first time I had to take a second job. It wasn't a choice. I didn't have the luxury of options. Bills piled up, and with no family support, I was left to figure it out myself. I worked nights in a cafe, sometimes until 2 a.m., and woke up early to catch classes. I barely slept, I barely ate, but I kept going. I had to. I could hear my parents' voices in my head, telling me that I wasn't cut out for this, that I needed to focus on what really mattered. I knew they wanted me to give up, to settle for a life of mediocrity just like they expected. But I refused. At the same time, I watched my brother glide through life. He was handed opportunities like a silver spoon was permanently attached to his mouth. He went off to the best schools, never had to work a day in his life, and was constantly showered with praise. While I was juggling multiple jobs and trying to catch up on my studies, he was living a life I could only dream of. And yet, they still saw me as the one who would never make it. There was one moment that stung more than the rest. I had just finished a long shift at the cafe, and I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. I was barely hanging on. When I came home that night, I found my parents in the living room, celebrating my brother's latest achievement. He had just been accepted to a prestigious internship, something he had done little to earn on his own. I stood there in the doorway, watching them congratulate him, and the bitterness in my chest was suffocating. They didn't even notice me. They didn't ask how my day had gone. They didn't care about the fact that I had been working nonstop for months to make my own dreams happen. That night, I went to bed in tears, but I wasn't crying for the lack of their support. I was crying because I was tired, tired of feeling like I wasn't good enough, tired of being told that my dreams weren't worthy of attention. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time, I made a vow to myself. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to let anyone define my worth. This struggle, this pain, it would all pay off. I would make them see that I wasn't invisible. I was going to rise. The years that followed were long and exhausting. Every day was a battle, one I fought alone. I kept my head down, worked hard, and kept pushing forward no matter how many times I wanted to quit. There were days when I was close to breaking, when I thought that maybe my parents were right, that maybe I wasn't cut out for this, that I wasn't worth the effort. But then I'd think back to that moment, lying in bed feeling defeated, and I'd remind myself that I was stronger than that. One of the hardest things to deal with wasn't just the physical exhaustion, it was the emotional toll. Every time my brother achieved something, it felt like a reminder of what I didn't have. Every success of his felt like another failure of mine. I wasn't just fighting for my future, I was fighting against the narrative that had been imposed on me for years, that I was less than, that my dreams didn't matter. But then something shifted. I began to see my struggles not as obstacles, but as stepping stones. Each challenge was teaching me something: how to be resourceful, how to fight harder, how to believe in myself when no one else did. I started to believe that this journey wasn't just about success. It was about proving to myself that I could survive the storm. And when the storm passed, I'd stand tall, stronger than ever. I found solace in the small victories: a paycheck that covered the rent, finishing a project ahead of deadline, the first time I sold a piece of work I had created from scratch. These little moments made me feel alive, made me feel like my dreams weren't out of reach after all. But even as these small victories built up, I knew that I couldn't stop here. My family's lack of support wasn't going to be the thing that defined me. It wasn't even going to be the thing that stopped me. In the end, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could rise from nothing, that I could make something of myself, even if they never saw my worth. And with every passing day, I grew more confident, more determined, and more convinced that success was mine for the taking. I wasn't just working for a future. I was building it from the ground up, brick by brick. It was 6 years before I could finally take a breath and look around at what I had built. 6 years of grinding, struggling, and doubting myself. And yet, somehow I had made it. I had achieved what they told me wasn't possible, what they said I didn't deserve. I had managed to claw my way to the top of my industry, despite every setback, every obstacle, and every moment when it felt like the world was pushing against me. One of the first things I did when I found myself starting to succeed was to stop comparing myself to my brother. I had spent so much of my life measuring my worth against his, thinking that somehow his success was a reflection of mine, or worse, that his success somehow made me less. But the reality was that we were on different paths. His path had been paved for him by my parents, by their financial support, by their belief in him. But my path was all mine. Built from scratch, with nothing but my own sweat and tears. That made it worth more than anything he would ever achieve. It wasn't until my life started changing that I began to truly see the world differently. The things I used to care about, what my family thought of me, whether they acknowledged my struggles, started to matter less and less. I no longer craved their approval, their acknowledgement, or even their love. What mattered now was what I had done for myself. What mattered was how far I had come, how much I had sacrificed, and how much I had earned. Success, I realized, wasn't just about the material things. It wasn't about money, fame, or accolades. It was about standing in the face of every challenge and saying, I will not be defeated. It was about rising from the ashes of a life that had been filled with rejection and doubt and building something new. The day I received my first big offer, I couldn't believe it. It came out of nowhere, an offer to work with a company that had always been out of my reach, a company that I had once thought was beyond me. They'd heard about my work through a series of connections, and they were willing to offer me an opportunity I'd only dreamed of. The sense of accomplishment I felt in that moment wasn't about the job itself. It was about proving to myself that all those years of struggle had not been in vain. I didn't tell my parents about the offer at first. I didn't need to. For once, I was making decisions for myself without needing to ask for validation or approval. But I couldn't help but think about how different the conversation would be this time. They had always been so quick to dismiss me, to tell me that I was dreaming too big, that my goals were unrealistic. And yet, here I was, standing on the verge of something that would change my life forever. As I started to make more money, gain more recognition, and solidify my place in the industry, the silence between me and my family grew. It wasn't just the absence of support, it was the absence of any real connection. They didn't care to understand what I had done or how I had gotten here. It was as if they had written me off so completely that they couldn't even acknowledge my success when it was staring them in the face. But at that point, I didn't need them to. In those 6 years, I learned what it truly meant to succeed. It wasn't just about doing well in a job or gaining accolades. It was about learning to trust yourself, to believe in your own worth even when no one else did. It was about showing up every single day no matter how tired you were, no matter how many people told you it wasn't worth it. Looking back, I realized that it wasn't the lack of support from my parents that had been the hardest part. It was the feeling of being invisible, of knowing that I was capable of so much more, but being told I wasn't worth the investment. I had spent so much time wishing they could see me, wishing they could see my worth. But in the end, I didn't need them to. I had learned to see myself, and that was all that mattered. And then came the moment when it all hit me. My brother, still coasting on the efforts of others, had finally gotten his big break. He had the best of everything handed to him: the education, the resources, the connections. But what he didn't have was the fire, the hunger that I had. He didn't understand what it took to fight for what you wanted, because he had never had to. He was still the golden child, still wrapped in the comfort of family favoritism. It wasn't jealousy that I felt in that moment, but something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain. I realized that while he was living in a world of privilege, I was living in one of true accomplishment. My success had been earned, and that made all the difference. I had been knocked down, ignored, and overlooked for so long that when I finally reached the top, the view was sweeter than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't the money, the career, or even the recognition that felt the most satisfying. It was knowing that I had done it on my own, that I had overcome every single obstacle in my way and created a life for myself without anyone's help. At that moment, I knew that nothing could take that away from me. And that was the first time in my life that I truly felt free. Free from the weight of expectations, free from the shackles of family bias, and free from the need for approval. I had done it, and nothing, no one, could ever erase that. The more I rose, the more my family stayed stagnant in their old ways. They were stuck in the past, stuck on their expectations, and stuck in their outdated views of who I was. It was becoming clear to me that the longer I stayed quiet, the longer I allowed them to think that I needed them. The longer I would remain tethered to that past version of myself, one that couldn't break free of their opinions or their dismissals. But that would change now. By this point, I had more than just financial success under my belt. I had earned respect in my industry, built a reputation that couldn't be taken away, and made connections that were far more valuable than the shallow ties of family. The satisfaction I felt was real, undeniable, but I also knew that something had to change. The silence between me and my family was no longer peaceful. It had become oppressive. I had reached the top of my career, but I still had to face the reality that they wouldn't acknowledge my success. Not fully. I thought about how many years I had spent wishing they would see me. It was a lifetime of hoping for their recognition, of waiting for them to come around and see my worth. But the truth hit me hard. They would never see me as I saw myself. I wasn't their golden child, and that would always be a barrier. And that's when I knew I had to do something bold, something that would force them to see me. It wasn't about revenge, it was about taking control of my own narrative. I would no longer be the backdrop to their story, the invisible figure in the family photo. I would stand in front of it, unapologetic and whole. The catalyst came unexpectedly. I received an invitation to a family event, something that wasn't unusual, but given the tension between us, I knew this would be the perfect opportunity. It was a fancy dinner, a celebration of my brother's latest success. The moment I saw the invitation, I felt an overwhelming urge to go. It wasn't to prove anything to them, not directly, but to show them just how far I had come. It was time to stop hiding in the shadows. They had forgotten that I was capable of more than what they'd ever seen. The day of the dinner arrived, and as I prepared, I couldn't help but smile. I had spent years dressing in hand-me-downs and worn-out clothes, never feeling worthy of the lavish events they attended. But this time, I was different. This time, I dressed not for their approval, but for myself. I chose an outfit that reflected who I was now, confident, independent, and unapologetically successful. When I walked into that room, everything shifted. My brother, who was seated at the head of the table, looked up and froze. My parents, too, stopped mid-conversation. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the change was palpable. I had walked into a room where I was no longer invisible. I wasn't looking for their acknowledgement anymore. I wasn't looking for their approval. I had come for one reason only, to show them who I had become. Dinner was awkward, but I didn't care. The questions were shallow, the conversation strained. I was aware of every glance, every comment, every attempt they made to keep up the facade of normalcy. They had tried to pretend I was just another sibling, just another afterthought. But tonight, I was the one who held their attention. At one point, my mother asked about my career as if she were making an effort to understand what I had been doing. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to seem interested, to seem like she cared, but it was too late. The years of neglect had built walls between us that couldn't be undone with a polite question. I was done waiting for them to care. The moment came when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a company I had been negotiating with for months, a major deal that was about to close. The text confirmed everything I'd been working for. As I read it, a wave of calm washed over me. This was it. I had made it. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide it. I stood up, quietly excused myself, and walked to the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at myself. For years, I had been told I wouldn't amount to anything. For years, my dreams were mocked, my achievements downplayed. But standing there in that moment, I realized that I didn't need anyone's recognition. I had done this on my own, and no matter what happened after tonight, that truth would never change. When I returned to the table, my parents were still laughing with my brother. But now it was different. I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They knew that something had shifted. I had stepped into the light, and there was no going back. Dinner ended quietly. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to justify my success. It was clear. It was final. I had earned everything I had, and nothing could take that from me. When I left the restaurant that night, I didn't feel the usual weight of disappointment. I didn't feel small or overlooked. I felt free. For the first time in years, I was no longer begging for validation. I had learned that my success didn't depend on anyone else's approval. As I drove home that night, I thought about everything I had gone through to get to this point. All the years of rejection, all the hours of work, all the sacrifices, it was all worth it. But what mattered most was that I had built my life on my own terms, and no one, not even my family, could take that away. The world may have overlooked me for years, but I had created something for myself that was undeniable. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The weeks following that dinner were oddly quiet. I expected some sort of confrontation, some attempt by my parents or my brother to address the tension that had built up. But there was nothing. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the shift that had happened in front of them. They simply carried on as if nothing had changed. In their minds, I was still that quiet, obedient child who never dared to rock the boat. But I had already realized something. They had underestimated me, and they weren't going to get away with it anymore. It was no longer about seeking their approval. I was no longer hoping that one day they would see my worth. I had seen it for myself, and that was all that mattered. But there was still something unsettling about how they continued to treat me. They ignored my achievements, pretended like they didn't matter, and brushed off any mention of my success. It was as if they were too proud, too stubborn to admit that they had been wrong about me all these years. At first, I thought it would be best to ignore them, to let them live in their delusions. But something about it gnawed at me. The more they dismissed me, the stronger my resolve became. I wasn't going to let them continue acting as though I was insignificant. If they wanted to ignore the fact that I had built something from the ground up, then I would force them to see it. I decided to take matters into my own hands in the most unexpected way. I started sharing more openly about my accomplishments, not in a boastful way, but in a way that made it impossible for them to ignore. I posted updates on social media, not for validation, but for visibility. I started attending events and networking with people they could never have imagined being in the same room with. I made sure my success was undeniable, and I made sure they saw it. But I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to hold up my success for inspection. I had done everything on my own, without their help, without their validation. And that fact alone was the most powerful thing I could show them. In a way, my silence was the loudest message I could send. Every time they attempted to dismiss me or pretend like I hadn't succeeded, I responded with nothing but more achievements. I built my business, I made important connections, and I continued to climb higher. With every step I took, the gap between us widened. They couldn't pretend I was still the person they had written off all those years ago. The silence was more powerful than any words. I watched as they tried to fill the gap with superficial praise for my brother, but I didn't flinch. I didn't need their praise. I didn't need them to acknowledge my hard work. They could keep their approval because I no longer cared. And that, I realized, was my victory. It wasn't about getting their attention. It was about creating a life that was mine. A life that didn't depend on their recognition or their approval. A life where I didn't need to prove anything to them anymore. I began to understand something that had taken me years to grasp. Success, true success, isn't about reaching the top. It's about leaving behind the people and the relationships that held you down. It's about realizing that you are your own validation. My family might never understand me, but that was no longer my problem. I wasn't living my life for them. I was living it for me. The more I grew into my success, the more they shrank. They couldn't keep up with me. They couldn't acknowledge what I had achieved, not because they didn't see it, but because they refused to. I had stopped being a part of their story. I wasn't the one they could mold or control anymore. I had become my own person, my own force to be reckoned with, and they couldn't do anything to stop it. There came a point when they started to realize that this new version of me wasn't just a phase. It wasn't a rebellion or a fluke. It was who I had become. And no matter how much they wished I would go back to the quiet, invisible child they had known, I wasn't coming back. In the beginning, I had hoped they would see me. I had hoped they would come to recognize my worth. But now I no longer needed them to see anything. I didn't need them to validate me. I was already validating myself. And that, in the end, was the most powerful statement I could make. It wasn't just about success. It was about reclaiming my power. It was about showing the world, and most importantly myself, that I didn't need anyone's permission to rise. I had done it, and no one, not even my family, could take that from me. So I continued. I continued building, growing, and succeeding, not for them, not for anyone but myself. The silence between us remained, and with each passing day, it became clearer that I had won. It wasn't until my family tried to undermine my success that the true breaking point arrived. It had been building for months, my growing success, the widening gap between us, and their attempts to ignore the truth that I had carved a path for myself without their help. They thought that if they kept pretending it wasn't happening, I would eventually return to being the person I was before, the one who quietly accepted their neglect, the one who didn't question their favoritism. But I wasn't that person anymore. The moment it happened was so subtle that I almost missed it. I received a phone call from my mother, unexpected and unusually calm. She asked how I was doing, about work, about everything. She seemed almost normal. After years of silence, the sudden attempt at connection was jarring, but I didn't let my guard down. She then dropped a bombshell that would change everything. "I spoke to your brother," she said, her voice a little too casual. "He's been worried about you. He thinks you're isolating yourself. Maybe you're not as successful as you say. You don't want him to worry, do you?" There it was, the subtle implication that my success wasn't real, that somehow, despite everything I had built, it was all a lie, that the work I had put into creating a life of my own wasn't valid. They wanted to believe their narrative of me, that I was still just their little girl struggling to make it, and that my brother was the one who really had it all together. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I had spent years playing the role of the person who was always seeking approval, always waiting for them to see my worth, but no more. It was time for me to take the control back completely. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain myself. I simply thanked her for the call, hung up, and sat in silence for a long while. In that moment, I understood that no matter how high I climbed, no matter how far I moved from their grasp, they would always try to hold me in the past. They would always try to fit me into their narrow vision of who I should be. But it was their failure, not mine. They couldn't see the truth because it was too uncomfortable for them. They couldn't accept that I had made it without their support. I didn't need to argue with them. I didn't need to try and change their minds. The truth was clear. I had succeeded. I had proven my worth, and I had done it entirely on my own. From that moment on, I stopped hiding. I didn't keep my success in the shadows anymore. I posted openly about the deals I closed, the businesses I was involved in, and the recognition I was getting. Every victory I posted was like a silent defiance against everything they had ever tried to impose on me. It was no longer about showing them. I had nothing left to prove to them. It was about owning my story, finally and fully. The more they tried to undermine me, the louder my success became. And as I watched them squirm, I realized that this was my moment of true freedom. They could no longer define me, no longer control the narrative. I didn't need them to understand my journey. I didn't need them to recognize how hard I had worked. I had already achieved what they said was impossible. I had built a life for myself that was mine, and no one could take that from me. By the time I reached this point, I had built everything I needed, and I no longer felt any need to be entangled in the family dynamic that had caused me so much pain. Their denial of my achievements no longer mattered to me. The years of struggle had shaped me into someone who didn't need to explain themselves. I had won, but there was one final thing I had to do. One final act to cement my freedom. It wasn't going to be a dramatic showdown, a confrontation where I yelled or demanded answers. Number it would be the quietest, most powerful statement I could make. I was walking away. I had been invited to yet another family dinner. They had made the same empty attempt at reconciliation that they always did when they needed something. This time, it was because they wanted to clear the air. After all, the tension had been building for months, and my absence had clearly started to bother them. But I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I didn't need their approval, and I certainly didn't need to be around them to prove my worth. So I made a decision. I would go to the dinner, but not to appease them. I would go to show them that I no longer needed to be part of their world to be successful. I arrived at the restaurant on time, just like I always did. But this time, I was different. I had no intention of engaging in their superficial chatter or pretending like I cared about their small talk. I sat down, nodded politely, and listened to the forced pleasantries around me. But the moment I noticed the uncomfortable looks they exchanged, my mother glancing nervously at my father, my brother glancing at his phone, I knew it was time. I stood up to leave. I didn't make a scene. I didn't argue or shout. I simply stood, adjusted my jacket, and without looking back, I walked out the door. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was done. I had reached the point where I didn't need to play their game. For the first time, I realized that I was free. Free from the toxic expectations, the biased opinions, and the years of being treated as if I wasn't good enough. I didn't need their approval. I had built something for myself, and that was all that mattered. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. I knew that nothing they could say would change who I had become. And I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their world of dismissiveness and neglect. That was the final moment of liberation for me. I had broken free, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet confidence that I didn't need to explain myself anymore. My life, my achievements, my worth, all of it belonged to me, and nothing, not even my family, could take that from me. When I drove away that night, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt lighter, as if I had finally let go of something that had been holding me back for far too long. I knew in that moment that I had truly made it, and I was ready for whatever came next. The years of struggle, of pain, of proving myself, all of it had led me here, to a place of quiet peace and freedom. I had broken away from the toxic patterns of my past, from the people who refused to see my worth, and built something for myself, something that no one could take away. I had become the person I always knew I could be, despite their doubts, despite their neglect. My success wasn't measured by the money I made, the deals I closed, or the accolades I received. It was measured by the fact that I had finally learned to live on my own terms. No longer dependent on anyone else's validation, I had built a life that was entirely my own. The weight of years of unspoken resentment, the need for approval, all of that had been left behind. What I had now was something far more valuable: self-respect and independence. I realized that for years, I had been seeking permission to be who I was. I wanted my family to see me, to understand me, to finally recognize my worth. But in the end, I didn't need them to. I had proven it to myself. I had come from nothing, built something incredible, and no one, least of all them, could ever take that from me. As I stood there, looking at the life I had created, I knew that my journey wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming my story, about showing the world and myself that I was never invisible, that I was capable of so much more than they ever imagined. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had given myself everything I had ever needed. And with that, I walked away from the past into a future where my worth would never be questioned again.